So before we start, make sure that you have your Latin Alive Book 2, Chapter 16 student note page out, because that is what we're going to fill in today before we come to class. We're going to start with a relative clause review. Last week we looked at dependent clauses that function like adverbs, and we called them adverbial clauses. Now remember, an adverb, as you know, modifies a verb. And usually you've known that to be one word that modifies. Now we can have whole clauses, a whole group of words that can modify a verb. So an adverbial clause generally describe a time, a location, a cause, or even a condition, and the whole clause serves to modify the verb. Now last year you studied relative clauses, and a relative clause is a type of dependent clause called an adjective clause. Now, so adjectives modify nouns, okay? And it's called an adjective clause because it acts like the adjective, the whole set of words, instead of being a single adjective, acts like an adjective in the sentence. Now, the clause describes the subject noun, not just any noun, but the subject noun, which is also called the antecedent. Do you remember ante means before? So the subject noun always comes before the clause. Now, an adjective clause will always contain, just like last week when we did an adverbial clause, a dependent clause will always contain a subject and a verb. However, it can't stand alone as a complete thought. So basically, it doesn't make complete sense. Just because something has a subject and a verb in it does not mean it's a complete sentence. And that's the trouble that a lot of middle schoolers and young kids who are learning to write, they think it's a complete sentence because it contains a subject and a verb, and it actually doesn't make sense when it stands on its own. So you studied relative pronouns. And in English, those are whom, whose, that, and which. So in Latin, this is important to remember, there is always, that will help you, there's always a relative pronoun that introduces the clause and refers or relates to, that's why it's called a relative clause, because it relates to, like you're related to a person like your aunt or your uncle. It relates to the antecedent. So in Latin, these pronouns are qui, quae, quod. Did you remember that from last year? Your chart should be filled out. Qui, quae, quod. In English, however, sometimes a relative pronoun is left out. I threw away the food you left out. That's what we normally say. The word here that it would be in Latin that we don't have in English is that. Good news is Latin always has one, so it doesn't ever skip them. So a relative pronoun must agree with its antecedent in number and gender, but not in case. If you remember, adjectives normally have to agree with the noun they modify in gender, case, and number, but not with a relative pronoun. So a relative pronoun can have an entirely different job than the antecedent. And remember that it'll help you to figure out the job of the relative pronoun if you substitute the nominative, right, or the antecedent for the relative pronoun. Now, below, I'm going to have you do this, so pause after we talk about this and unpause when you're ready to correct it. So I want you to circle the relative pronoun and its antecedent and then underline the relative clause. And I want you to identify the case, number, and gender of the relative pronoun and translate the pronoun only. So go ahead and pause and come back when you have done that. So, what is our relative pronoun? Remember, it's the who, which, that kind of thing. It's pretty obvious. It is the who. Now, who does the who refer to? It can't refer to anything, built many things, because it comes before the hand, and the antecedent is always, remember, antecedent always describes the subject noun. So here you have two choices. You can either say it was Hadrian, or you can say emperor. Either one of them will be the antecedent because this is a to be verb. So basically emperor renames Hadrian. Either one of those would be correct. So the whole clause starts with the relative pronoun and contains everything. So the relative clause would be built many things. Now, how do you know what the noun job of who is? What we do is we substitute the nominative for the relative pronoun. We already know that it's emperor or Hadrian. We can plug either one, any in. And if we plugged Hadrian in for who, we could read it, Hadrian built many things. Clearly, Hadrian, in this case, or the who, is the nominative singular. So it is the nominative singular. Remember, it doesn't always have the same job, but sometimes it does. And since Hadrian is singular, Hadrian is nominative, and when you translate it, it would have to have the same gender. So the gender, because Hadrian is a person, people are always their own genders, masculine and feminine. It has to be masculine. Okay, there's never a neuter gender for a person. Despite what the world says today, in Latin, people can only be masculine and feminine. So in this case, it actually does match, but it doesn't, and the who is nominative singular, but it doesn't always. So if you looked at your who, you would know that in Latin, that pronoun is qui quod. Remember, it's the nominative singular. Okay. Second one, let's look at the other one. Hadrian's wall had many forts in which the soldiers and their families lived. So if you look at your list of potential relative pronouns, you'll see that which is the relative pronoun. What you do notice here is who, what is the which? What is it referring to? The wall soldiers and their families lived, or is it the word fort? So it's actually, what did their soldiers and families live in? The families didn't live in the wall, the families lived in the forts. So forts, I'm going to erase this right here so we're not confused with the one above. Forts is actually the antecedent because the soldiers and their families lived in forts. Now, to underline the whole thing, you're going to need to include the in, because if you didn't, because remember, you could you could stop the sentence, and you could take out the relative clause. You know the in belongs, because if you stopped it right here before the in, you would not make Hadrian's wall had many forts in. That does not make any sense. So you know that the relative clause has to include the word in it. So the question is, what is the job of which? So we're going to substitute forts. So if we took which and wrote in, I just erased that, sorry, in which soldiers and their families lived. If we took the word which and substituted forts, now turn it into a complete sentence so it makes sense. In forts, their soldiers and their families lived. Doesn't make sense. So rewrite it. Soldiers and their families lived in forts. So you have to go, so if I wrote it down, soldiers and their families, do it so it makes sense, lived in forts. What do you see already? You see already that that is a prepositional phrase, in forts. And we see that it is ablative, plural, because it's in, the word in. So already we know that it has to be ablative, plural, and if you know the word forts, it has to match, the gender of which has to match, and the gender is neuter.